intrinsic connection between the Bandanese and the landscape they inhabited. They could simply be replaced by workers and managers who would transform their archipelago into a nutmeg-producing factory. This was a radically new way of envisioning the earth as a vast machine made of inert particles in ceaseless motion. Even in Europe, the mechanistic vision of the world had only just begun to take shape in the 17th century, and then too only among elites. The fact that it happened against the backdrop of the European conquest of the Americas was not coincidental. It was in the wake of the subjugation of those continents that educated upper-class European men began to think of themselves as the subduers of all they surveyed, even in their own countries, and especially within the domain they conceived of as nature, an inert repository of resources which, in order to be improved, needed to be expropriated, no matter whether from Amerindians or Indians or Indonesians or European peasants. But this conception of nature did not apply only to non-human resources. People like Amerindians, Africans, Asians were similarly thought to belong to nature, and were therefore also thought to be eligible for appropriation, enslavement, or extermination, as was the case with the Bandanese. Actually, after the Bandanese were exterminated, the Dutch put in a system in the Banda Islands where these became plantations run with slave labor, and the slaves were almost entirely from India. Just like non-human resources, these humans too were regarded as mute, brutish, and devoid of agency. Today, not even the most die-hard positivist or mechanist would claim, at least explicitly, that there exists any category of humans who are mute or devoid of agency. But what about non-humans? There are many people in the world, and many, if not most of them perhaps, are indigenous peoples, who continue to believe that plants, trees, animals, and even geological features are neither mute nor lacking in agency. But very few of these people belong to dominant global elites, and even fewer are located within the academy or within universities. For historians, economists, and other academics, non-human entities are still seen as inert and incapable of agency. In that sense, their way of enframing the world is still very much founded on the ideologies that rose to dominance in the wake of European empires in the 17th century. Students at a university may learn about the history and economics of the nutmeg trade, but it would be inconceivable for them to be taught to sing songs about the nutmeg, honoring them as sentient beings, as the Bandanese still do. Even in anthropology departments, it's inconceivable that they would teach their students to sing songs about nutmegs or any other spice. One notable feature of the mechanistic ideologies of the Enlightenment is that they were radically centered on humanity. Human beings were regarded as being exalted over all other creatures, and the principal mark of their superiority lay in their possession of language and in their ability to make and understand meaningful statements. Within this view, only humans possess the ability to speak and to act intentionally, and not least, to make history. These views were, it should be noted, largely held by elite European men. Across the planet, there were always many, many people who believed, and still do, that there exist some or many kinds of beings who can and do speak. Nor are these views held only by non-Westerners. Even in Europe and other parts of the West, there have always existed many people who believed that humans were not the only beings endowed with souls and the capacity to make and understand meaning. But such people were regarded by elite Westerners as superstitious and deluded primitives and animists. To be civilized was to accept that the earth is inert and machine-like, and that no aspect of it in principle can elude human knowledge. Indeed, the very idea that other than human beings had souls or could speak was regarded as a sign of savagery that needed to be suppressed or eradicated with extreme violence if necessary. And nowhere was this violence greater than in North America, where Native Americans, even though they belonged to a country founded upon the idea of freedom of religion, but Native American religion was savagely suppressed. So to this day, it's taken for granted by many, if not most educated people, that a question like, can non-humans speak, is, on its face, absurd. Yet, the matter is not as easily settled as it may first appear. For the question, can non-humans speak, conjures up a number of other queries. For example, who and what is human? Today, the definition of human is often tied to the binomial name Homo sapiens, the wise ape, a taxonomic category that was invented by Linnaeus in 1758. The date tells us a great deal about the phrase Homo sapiens. For example, that it was born of the European Enlightenment, amid the emergence of what we now regard as science. According to the Linnaean definition, all members of the class Homo sapiens are a single species. Yet, Linnaeus also divided the species into various subspecies, according to geography and physical attributes. In other words, even as the Enlightenment was producing the idea of the human as a single species, it was also negating that idea. Hence, many, if not most, Enlightenment philosophers believed that there existed a natural hierarchy within the species Homo sapiens, so that some races and classes were more human than others. And we, all of us sitting here, more or less, were pretty much near the bottom. We cannot forget that the New World, for example, was represented by its European conquerors as a world without humans, and that it was this that allowed them to attempt the mass extermination of indigenous peoples, as with the Bandanese. So we are confronted with the paradox that the invention of the human went hand in hand with a process of disaggregation, whereby the faculties of speech and reasoning were not regarded as being distributed equally among all humans. Needless to add, these beliefs held powerful sway through much of the 19th and 20th centuries and are with us today in vestigial forms. Now, let us for a moment consider a contrary possibility, one in which living things of many kinds are able, if not to speak, then at least to articulate certain aspects of their being. This is not a far-fetched idea. We know now that trees in a forest are able to communicate with each other in certain circumstances. They can send help in the form of carbon to ailing members of their group, and they can warn each other about pestilence and disease. It's now thought that certain plants can even emit sounds that are inaudible to human ears, but are audible to some living things. This suggests that one problem with the question, can the non-human speak, lies in its wording, which rests on a term speak that is pinned to language. In that they lack this attribute, trees could be said to be mute. But in that we lack the ability to communicate as trees do, could it not be said that for a tree it is the human who is mute? So whose definition prevails? The answer to this, again, is far from obvious. It may seem to us that because we have the ability to chop down a tree, that it is we who decide who speaks and who is mute. But many trees have much longer lifespans than human beings. Some live for as long as 5,000 years. If indeed trees possessed ways of reasoning, we can be sure that they would be calibrated to a completely different timescale, perhaps one in which humans may go extinct or experience catastrophic mortality events. Such a world would be one in which trees could flourish as never before, on soil that will have been enriched by billions of decomposing human bodies. So it may appear self-evident to us that we are the gardeners who get to decide what happens to trees. Yet, from a different time scale, it might appear equally evident that it is the trees that are gardening us. And this is something I feel equally convinced of, that it is we who are being gardened. But perhaps this is all wrong. After all, trees and human beings are not, or not just, adversaries competing for space. They are also linked by innumerable forms of cooperation. Perhaps what is at fault here is the very idea of a single species. We now know that the human body contains vast numbers of microorganisms of various kinds. We know that we could not function without their presence. We know that microorganisms influence our moods, emotions, and ability to reason. So if it is true that the human ability to speak can only be actualized in the presence of other species, can it really be said that the faculty of speech is exclusive to humans? As Anat Singh points out in her brilliant book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, it seems increasingly that species do not evolve singly, but rather in close intimacy with other organisms. She cites the example of certain animals who are only able to develop fully when they encounter certain other specific microorganisms. But could it not also be said of humans that the presence of certain other species in specific moments of encounter enable them to transcend their own limitations? Consider one landmark moment in the history of human consciousness, the enlightenment of the Buddha. This event occurred while the Buddha was meditating under a Bodhi tree. Within the Buddhist tradition, for more than 2,000 years, the presence of this tree has been inseparable from that moment. This is not to say that the tree transmits illumination, or even that it is an active participant in the process. Nor is it at all the case that everyone who meditates under a Bodhi tree will achieve enlightenment. Yet it has long been accepted by millions of people that a trans-species encounter at a specific historical juncture was essential to the enlightenment of one particular human, Prince Siddhartha Gautama. And the Buddha himself believed the tree to be essential to his attainment of Nibbana, which is why millions of Buddhists consider the Bodhi tree to be sacred to this day. What does this tell us? It tells us, first of all, that certain kinds of trans-species associations cannot be approached as though they were processes or relationships. They are precisely encounters or events that occur at specific moments in time and are not repeatable. That means that such encounters can only be approached historically, by attending to the circumstances in which they occur. Secondly, it tells us that an awareness of the possibility of trans-species encounters of this sort has always existed among humans, for we need only think of the traditions that surround St. Francis of Assisi to recognize that there are many examples of such associations. So the true question then is not whether the non-human can speak, but rather when and how did some humans, and let it be noted that these humans are mainly people with university educations, how did these humans come to believe that other species are essentially brutes, incapable of articulation and agency? Literature's best-known brute is, of course, Shakespeare's Caliban, who makes his entrance in The Tempest, which is famously an allegory of colonialism. The name Caliban is probably an anagram for cannibal, a word that would originally have referred to a group of Amerindians. In the Tempest's dramatis personae, Caliban is listed as a savage and deformed slave, and the grotesqueness of his appearance is a recurrent theme in the play. Yet the essence of Caliban's brutishness does not lie in his external appearance. That is indeed the import of the famous lines in which Prospero reminds Caliban of the most important gift that he has given him. I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or other, when thou didst not, savage, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish. I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known. The essence of Caliban's brutishness lies then in his lack of language, in his inability to make meaning, even though he possesses the faculty of speech. Prospero's words, I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known, go straight to the heart of the colonizer's framing of the colonized. Despite possessing the uniquely human faculty of speech, brutish humans cannot produce meaning. Their sounds amount to mere gabble until the colonizer gives them words, which endows them at last with the ability to make meaning. Until then, no matter that they have tongues, voices, and languages, brutes are effectively mute, like nature itself, which also makes sounds but produces no meaning. In this view of the world, the sounds of nature are not equivalent to utterances. They are the products of mechanical responses and reactions. The muteness of nature and the muteness of the brute are thus reflections of each other. As a process, then, the muting of a large part of humanity by European colonizers cannot be separated from the simultaneous muting of nature. As the historian Joyce Chaplin writes, demystifying nature, displaying bodily strength, and using technology all became measures of colonial power. Colonization was thus not merely a process of establishing dominion over human beings, it was also a process of subjugating and reducing to muteness an entire universe of beings that was once thought of as having agency, powers of communication, and the ability to make meaning. Animals, trees, volcanoes, nutmegs. There are few more poignant accounts of this dual process of muting of colonized humans as well as non-humans than the words of Walking Buffalo, a stony Indian from Canada. He said, "Did you know that trees talk? Well, they do. They talk to each other, and they'll talk to you if you listen. Trouble is, white people don't listen. They never listen to the Indians, so I don't suppose they'll listen to other voices in nature." These are exactly the words that are today repeated by Adivasis. These mutings were essential to the process of establishing Western rule over the earth, because, as the philosopher Akil Bilgrami observes, in order to see something as a mere resource, we first need to see it as brute, as something that makes no normative demands of practical and moral engagement with us. It is thus by rendering a vast continuum of human and non-human beings into brutes that the colonizer turns them into resources to be used as slaves, servants, and commodities. This entire continuum was also believed to be subject to the natural laws that condemn certain species to extinction or extermination. The question of who is a brute and who is fully human, who makes meaning and who does not, who speaks and who is mute, lie at the core of the planetary crisis. At this moment in time, when we look back on the trajectory that has brought us to the brink of a planetary catastrophe, we cannot but recognize that our plight is a consequence of the ways in which certain classes of humans, a small minority, in fact, have actively muted others by representing them as brutes, creatures whose presence on earth is solely material. It was because of these assumptions that it was taken for granted that the greater part of humanity was intellectually and culturally incapable of industrializing. And that delusion is itself an essential component of the catastrophe that is now unfolding across the planet. Would the West have embarked on its reckless use of resources if it had imagined that a day might come when the rest of the world would adopt those very practices, just as the West had itself adopted innumerable non-Western practices and technologies? If this possibility had been acknowledged a century ago, then maybe some thought would have been given to the consequences. But through the 19th and much of the 20th centuries, it was an unstated assumption among those who ruled the world that most non-Westerners were simply too stupid, too brutish, to make the transition to industrial civilization on a mass scale. Concealed by abstractions, these assumptions undergirded a range of disciplines, academic disciplines like development studies and some branches of economics and sociology, in which poverty was ascribed to culture, a term that was often freighted with racial baggage. It is perhaps only in the last 2 or 3 decades that the West has awakened to something that it had not imagined possible, that the non-West is fully capable of adopting extractive, carbon-intensive economies and all that goes with them, like scientific and technological research, and certain genres of art and literature. Had it been acknowledged earlier that human beings are and have always been essentially mimetic creatures, perfectly capable of learning from each other, then perhaps sustainability would have become an urgent issue much earlier. But this possibility was precluded by long-held assumptions until the brutes began to unbrute themselves. The terrible irony is that the unbruting of the middle classes of the non-West was achieved precisely by repeating and even intensifying the processes of brutalization that was set in motion by Europe's colonial conquests. In India, over the last 3 decades, the beliefs, practices, and livelihoods of forest peoples have come under attack as never before. In hideous mimicries of the settler colonial treatment of Adivasis and indigenous people, more and more forest areas have been opened up to the mining and tourism industries, sometimes with the support of exclusionary conservationists who advocate the removal of Adivasis in the name of ecology. Forest people's sacred mountains have been desecrated. Their lands have been swamped by dams, and their beliefs and rituals have come under attack as primitive superstitions, exactly the terms that were once used by colonial administrators, scientists, and missionaries. The replication of colonial practices extends even to removing tribal children, Adivasi children, to boarding schools. Similar processes are underway also in China and in Indonesia. The difference is that these mimicries of colonial brutalization have unfolded not over centuries, but in a few decades, going back to 1990. Half the greenhouse gases that are now in the atmosphere were emitted in the last 30 years. It is this tremendous acceleration brought about by the worldwide adoption of colonial methods of extraction and consumption that has thrust us to the edge of the precipice. The compressed time frame, however, has seen to it that non-humans too are no longer as mute as they once were. Other beings and forces, bacteria, viruses, pathogens, glaciers, forests, the jet stream, now thrust themselves so exigently on our attention that we have had to recognize that we are no longer in the world of Galileo, where objects were placed beside each other without affecting each other. We are now in Gaia, which, as the philosopher Bruno Latour has pointed out, is a world of agents constantly interacting with each other. Everything we experience on Earth is the unforeseen, secondary, and involuntary effect of the action of living organisms. So I'm going to stop there because I see that we just have 10 minutes left. Yes? No, I'm always, I've heard enough of my own voice. So, thank you. Thank you.
Blazing trail of Russia-Ukraine war will impact the climate change, and what will be consequences? Secondly, as a intelligentsia here, I recommend to His Highness Rahulji, why not adopt a resolution and send it to the world over to all the leaders? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a very long question. I mean, it's a question that demands a very long answer. I think the Russia-Ukraine war is the greatest disaster to befall us in a very long time. And the reason for that is multiple. One is that it has re-legitimized the fossil fuel industries. It's given them absolutely a new lease of life. As you know, Germany now is proceeding very fast, commissioning coal-powered electricity and plants, many plants. Similarly, I think another really major impact of the Russia-Ukraine war is that it's taken away focus from the climate. Focus on the climate was diminishing anyway, but now it's completely changed, switched the attention span on climate. The third really important thing that it has shown us is that all global institutions have essentially broken down. I think of this, there can be no doubt about it. For a long time, there was a pretense of an international liberal order. But that international liberal order, in my view, was no longer on view even before the Russia-Ukraine war. If you remember the recent COP meeting, COP26 in Glasgow, 3 of the world's most important players didn't turn up. Xi Jinping wasn't there, Vladimir Putin wasn't there, Bolsonaro, most of all, wasn't there. And Bolsonaro was actually in Italy at the time on vacation, so he was thumbing his nose at the international community, such as it was. And Brazil today holds the future of the world in its hands. I mean, the Amazon is literally at a tipping point where it's going to tip over into savanna. It stops being a carbon sink and it's going to be a carbon emitter. So in every possible way, this war, this particular moment in time, is absolutely a global catastrophe. Even if it doesn't lead to nuclear war, which is a possibility, but even if it doesn't do that, it's going to be an absolute catastrophe. Another thing I should point out is that war is the single most, and many of you here are army related. My father was in the army. War is the single most destructive, environmentally destructive endeavor of humanity. No one's ever actually done a study of how much of global emissions is defense related, but it seems such studies have been done suggest that in America, 25% of America's emissions come from defense-related activities. The Pentagon is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. In a single year, during those years when the US military was active in Iraq, in a single year, the US military in just the Middle East was emitting more than the entire nation of Bangladesh, which consists of 180 million people. And the really bizarre thing about this is that this can never be talked about, because during the Kyoto Protocols, the US ensured that defense-related emissions could never come under discussion. So, I'm sorry to say, I think what Jan Koen said is right. Or rather what Epicurus said is right. War is the father of all things. And that is what we find ourselves in the middle of. Thank you.
Mr. Ghosh, thank you for that wonderful keynote speech. If I may ask, it seems that part of the violence that for example, the Dutch East India Company did. Oh, am I audible? Yes. It seems that part of the violence you described the Dutch East India Company doing to nature was to mute it, to describe it as inert and inert machines without agency. And you seem to be proposing uplifting or recognizing that nature is not mute. I wanted to ask you, what if that equalization happens instead by recognizing humans as mute? It seems like modern science wants to just reduce humans to computational machines, without agency. And I was curious to know what you thought of that worldview.
Thank you, Jay. Yes. Look, I think in the most basic sense, the whole idea which the whole European mechanistic scientific worldview promoted from the 17th century onwards was that the world is inert, the earth is inert, it just exists to be mined, as it were. But today it's scientists themselves who are pointing out that in fact, Wally Broker, one of the leading astrophysicists, said the climate is an angry beast and we poked it with sticks. So, these kinds of metaphors, which used to be called animistic, are now absolutely available within science itself. The very idea of Gaia, it's proposed by an engineer. And he speaks very much in animistic language. In fact, he calls for a restoration of anima, or soul, to the planet itself. I do think that, what we need here is a complete departure from those mechanistic ways of thinking, even where it concerns something like forests. Because, the British applied European forestry to India in the 19th century. Mainly German foresters were brought here. And their whole idea was the forest is a machine for producing timber, So when we look around here and see the deodars and everything, it looks very nice to us. But in fact, they exist because the primary forest was cut down. And the sign, when pines enter a region, it's always a sign of a degraded environment. So we already see the original oak forests of the Himalayas are all gone. In fact, the only place you can see them is across the border in Yunnan. Yes. I don't know if we have enough time. It's 12 o'clock and I'm meant to be... Someone said to me recently that only an incurable optimist would believe that there is hope for what? Look, I don't think it's I think the hope-despair binary is very misleading. I think we have to think of it rather as duty, as our karma. We have to try to do what we can simply because of that. It's our karma. It's our karma and our dharma.
Just a quick question, I'm so sorry, but with regard to this sort of agency, right, that we've been talking about, that's either being taken away or being given, indigenous communities have been using plants to alter human perception for God knows how many years, and going from ayahuasca and opium into now the modern space of, coffee and smoking weed. And so I feel like we've sort of forgotten how to even perceive the world and ourselves without the mediation of plants. And so I wonder, where does the agency lie in this moment, right? Is it the plants who are sort of exerting this control over our perception, or are we, in using their powers, are we exerting that power over them?
Thank you, Kai. It's like you've just described my next book, because actually, India, the Indian subcontinent, was the first place to really embrace cannabis sativa, bhang, charas, etc. And these were the use was very, very widespread within India. And then it was opium, and the British turned opium into the same way, resources grown basically on plantations. But I think if you study the history of opium, it becomes very clear that opium is using us. That there's more opium grown in the world every passing year than ever before. The opium trade is one of basically heroin. We are seeing a huge sort of, as you know, a huge epidemic of addiction, especially in this region. It's perfectly clear that, no human effort to contain opium has ever been effective, except for a very brief period in the 50s when India and China created these anti-colonial movements against opium. But it's a very grim history, I really think the elders of the plant world got together at a certain point, when humanity was in its infancy, and said, these are very dangerous creatures. Let's give them something that will help them destroy themselves.